Welcome to the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. The Defense Horizon Journal is a professional and academic journal that features essays, reports, and analyses covering geopolitics and law, security and defense policy, peace and conflict studies, applied military science, as well as developments in weapons technology. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org.
Episode number 100. Clausewitz for the Digital Battlespace. By Peter Papala. I saw it in every unit I ever led. We never pause for the appropriate amount of time and say, what does this mean? What do we think about that? Let's talk about the ugly things, let's talk about the hard things, let's talk about the things that no one's talking about that we need to. General Officer. From modern certainty to postmodern complexity in military education. Karl von Clausewitz, 1780 to 1831, lived and died less than 2 centuries before the Internet, but he would have recognized many of the dynamics it introduces to conflict today. It is one of history's great ironies that the West's seminal treatise on war was edited and published, so, at minimum, influenced by his wife Marie. Concepts like the fog of war, the inherent confusions of conflict, and friction, the way plans never work out exactly as expected when facing a thinking foe, all draw on his monumental work. In his view, war is politics with other means, or the continuation of political intercourse with the addition of other means. Modernist education assumes knowledge is objective, transferable, and best transmitted through lectures. Postmodern education treats knowledge as constructed, contextual, and best learned through experience. The operational environment confronting professional officers at all historical periods is marked by uncertainty, ambiguity, competition, and change. Technological progress has accelerated these since Clausewitz's time. These characteristics are not incidental, they are constitutive of the postmodern condition of military practice, emerging from the broader transformation of armed forces after the Cold War. Postmodernism here refers not to an artistic movement but to an epistemological shift, the recognition that knowledge, including military knowledge, is historically and culturally situated. Professional military education, PME, if it is to educate officers for a higher chance of winning battles and campaigns, must promote innovation rather than mere compliance and therefore move beyond modernist assumptions of universal knowledge, standardized competence, and context-free decision-making. Postmodern military operations require officers who can interpret, judge, and act within unfolding situations. Innovation in this context, embedded in education, is not primarily technological, it is epistemic and pedagogical. It concerns how officers understand the world, themselves, and their professional practice. Knowledge, including military knowledge, is not discovered as an objective reality but constructed through interaction with the world, others, artificial intelligence, AI, and oneself. This shift has profound implications for PME. Learning can no longer be conceived as the transmission of authoritative knowledge from instructor to student, but as an active, situated process embedded in practice. The influence of theoretical truths on practical life, according to Clausewitz, is always exerted more through critical analysis than through doctrine. Critical analysis, being the application of theoretical truths to actual events, not only reduces the gap between the two but also accustoms the mind to these truths through their repeated application. Military operations are complex adaptive systems in which outcomes emerge from interactions rather than linear causality. For example, the outcome of a battle depends on countless interactions among friendly and enemy forces, as well as on thinking and adaptive systems, weather, morale, logistics, and communications, none of which can be predicted with certainty. Officers must therefore be educated to recognize patterns, tolerate uncertainty, and adjust their mental models as situations evolve. Complexity undermines the modern pedagogical preference for closed problems with correct answers, foregrounding judgment, sense-making, and ethical discernment. For PME, this means that competence, as a combination of knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs, cannot be fully specified in advance. What counts as good officer performance depends on cultural, political, moral, strategic, and war-fighting contexts. Consequently, educating officers for innovation requires pedagogical designs that expose learners to contextual variation, complexity, and constructivism, rather than shielding them from them with education rooted in universalism, structure, and objectivity. Implications for educating officers for innovation. Launching an initiative within a large organization, a new operation or campaign in the military field, or a new enterprise has always been a hit or miss proposition. One practical framework for operationalizing postmodern educational principles is the lean startup methodology. This movement, with roots in lean manufacturing methodology which originated from Japan with the Toyota production system, favors experimentation over elaborate planning, end-user feedback over intuition, and iterative design over traditional, big design upfront development. Its concepts, such as minimum viable product and pivoting, have taken root in the startup world, and business schools have already begun adapting their curricula to teach them. As the United States, U.S., forces confronted the Taliban as a thinking and adaptive foe in 2010. Hacking for Defense, H4D, initiatives were launched, on one side, to give students hands-on experience in understanding and working on actual defense problems, on the other, to support fighters with innovative solutions on the battlefield. Students and cadets learn to innovate at speed and deploy solutions using lean startup to solve national security problems. H4D is a university course sponsored by the Department of Defense that trains students to work with the defense and intelligence communities to rapidly address the nation's emerging threats and security challenges. Modern militaries devote immense intellectual and organizational energy to campaign planning. Staff produce detailed assessments, phase designs, decision points, and end-state descriptions for different courses of action, using concept design as part of campaign planning to reduce uncertainty and impose coherence on complex conflicts. Wargame development is the process that informs the wargame design, reduces uncertainty, and imposes coherence by playtesting the latest design. To do development correctly, the developers need to attempt to break the wargame. The developers should thoroughly test each component of the wargame and the wargame as a whole. Nevertheless, in war, the belief manifests as faith in the perfect campaign design and related plan, a conviction that the future can be predicted, sequenced, and controlled. This contradiction is best illustrated by recent conflicts and failures in campaign design and planning. In Clausewitz's view, the major battle is the center of gravity of the entire conflict or campaign, and winning is a matter of finding and neutralizing an adversary's center of gravity. One of the causes for campaign design, planning, and execution failures could have been frames of reference, described by Geras and Wong as complex knowledge structures we develop through personal and professional experiences that influence and often limit the way we approach issues. For example, officers who have a mindset trained only for conventional maneuver warfare may struggle to adapt their mindset and actions to counterinsurgency. The most important periods for the development of military officers' frames of reference are the military academy and their first assignments. The Afghanistan War evolved from a successful regime collapse operation, 2001, into a protracted counterinsurgency, ultimately ending in state failure and rapid Taliban reconquest, 2021, due to misaligned strategy, external sanctuary, and inability to build a self-sustaining Afghan state. The U.S. failure in Afghanistan had the same roots, according to Scheik et al., in a mentality, in a frame of reference, that can only be convinced of the follies of nation-building in a country like Afghanistan after the vast wastage of human and material resources expended over a 20-year period. The Iraq War offers a similar lesson in framing failures. The Iraq War began as a highly successful, rapid conventional maneuver campaign, 2003, culminating in the seizure of Baghdad, but transitioned into a protracted insurgency due to strategic miscalculations in post-war governance. The U.S. failure in Iraq, according to George Tenet, was grounded in Army organizational design and the planned type of war they should fight. The U.S. government assumed that the occupation of Iraq would resemble the post-World War II occupation of Germany, a relatively stable transition to self-governance. It soon became clear that the purpose of the U.S. invasion was fundamentally to remake their society. Thomas Ricks found that the cause of the turmoil among troops in Iraq wasn't the quality of the commanders, but rather the disconnect between what the army was designed to do and what it actually found itself doing. The army was structured for big wars but was constantly fighting small wars. A third example comes from a different context, the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War. In Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan executed a technology-enabled operational dislocation campaign, combining unmanned aerial systems-enabled fires, maneuver along the southern axis, and culminating in a decisive special forces seizure of Shusha, forcing Armenian strategic collapse. John Antal considers the attack on Shusha and the integration of Azerbaijani drones at the army level, which enabled high-tech fires that decisively influenced the modern blitzkrieg victory. The Azerbaijani Spetsnaz executed a terrain-centric maneuver using mission command during the attack on Shusha, resulting in a rapid strategic collapse disproportionate to the size of the force. The opening Russian campaign in Ukraine in 2022 attempted a multi-axis strategic paralysis operation, decapitate the Ukrainian state, seize key terrain rapidly, and force political collapse before a coherent national defense could form, but it failed because its assumptions about Ukrainian resistance, readiness, logistics, command and control, and air-ground integration were wrong. Putin's entire invasion plan on Ukraine was premised on expectations that most Ukrainian soldiers would not fight and Kiev would meet the same fate as Baghdad in 2003, as Tripoli in 2011, as Kabul in the summer of 2021, where the American-trained Afghan National Army dissolved without much of a fight and went home. Campaigns fail when treated as execution problems and succeed when treated as search efforts. In complex conflicts, commanders are not merely implementing doctrine, they are discovering. What kind of conflict are they actually fighting? What does the adversary value and fear? What the population will support or resist? What political objectives are sustainable? Who the main military adversary is? Treating campaigns as execution problems leads to rigidity. Treating them as search problems legitimizes learning, adaptation, and strategic humility. However, this does not suggest militaries ought to abandon campaign planning. It remains essential. What must change is the campaign purpose. The perfect campaign is not a static blueprint for victory. It is a hypothesis-driven framework for learning faster than the adversary. Instead of promising certainty, it institutionalizes doubt. According to Kim Scott, author of the teaching approach Radical Candor, military culture is particularly vulnerable to a dangerous cognitive trap, the belief that conviction equals correctness. This approach is relevant to PME because it encourages the intellectual honesty needed to challenge flawed assumptions. Relentless directness exists at the intersection of caring personally and challenging directly, not to dominate students, but to help them do the best work of their professional lives by confronting flawed reasoning early. The US and Israel's attack on Iran is an example of how conviction equals correctness in practice. The recent US and Israeli attack on Iran follows the script, without taking into account senior mentor Paul Van Riper's observations and lessons from the 2002 exercise, Millennium Challenge, MC-02, which failed. From observation, the MC-02 scenario was scripted for a rapid and decisive conclusion by the Blue Joint Task Force, JTF. The Blue JTF did not arrive at that end state by engaging a thinking and adaptive enemy. The result was preordained. The supposed benefits of effects-based operations and operational net assessment were not made evident during the exercise. The 2026 war was not designed as a classic land campaign. It evolved into a multi-domain coercion campaign in which the decisive operational contest became control, closure, and reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, with both sides trying to convert military pressure into political concessions before the conflict spread irreversibly across the region. Clausewitz warned against precisely this illusion. War is governed by friction, uncertainty, and chance. Confidence unsupported by critical examination is not strength, but risk. Ideas must be stress-tested, challenged, and, at times, dismantled to develop disciplined judgment rather than false certainty. Michael Smith speculates that the essence of good strategy is premised upon the principle of proportionality. Acting with prudence might also be described as the principle of proportionality, and proportionality can be observed in the 44-day war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Clausewitz and educating officers for innovation. Educating officers for innovation requires a fundamental reorientation of pedagogy. Postmodernism does not abandon rigor or professionalism, it redefines them. Rigor lies in reflective judgment rather than procedural compliance, and professionalism in the capacity to act responsibly amid uncertainty. Constructivist, contextual, and dialogical educational practices do not guarantee innovation, but they create the conditions under which innovative thinking and action can emerge as integral features of the officer profession rather than exceptional traits. Theory and its resultant doctrines are thus subordinate to the great creative talent and to the universals of reason and feeling that it expresses. Clausewitz himself was still far from having formulated a theory explaining why and how the action of genius should be the ultimate guide. Clausewitz's core methodological claim is that war resists universal rules because it is shaped by friction, chance, and human will, and thus requires creative talent. He insisted that theory should educate judgment, not prescribe action. Abstract models, he warned, strip war of precisely those elements that matter most: the local, the singular, and the contingent. This resonates with the lean startup's rejection of heavyweight upfront planning. From a lean startup perspective, this critique mirrors the rejection of heavyweight upfront planning. Lean startup methodology similarly argues that complex, uncertain environments cannot be mastered through predictive planning alone. Instead, learning emerges through iteration, experimentation, and feedback. The lean startup reconceives a startup as a series of experiments that test its strategy to see which parts are brilliant and which are crazy. A true experiment follows the scientific method. It begins with a clear hypothesis that makes predictions about what should happen. It then tests those predictions empirically. Just as scientific experimentation is informed by theory, startup experimentation is guided by the startup's vision. Clausewitz's preference for historical case studies over formulas parallels the lean emphasis on validated learning over static business plans. Innovation is no longer an episodic advantage but a structural necessity. Yet many systems of PME remain oriented toward reproduction of doctrine, procedural compliance, and risk avoidance. This raises a fundamental question: how should officers be educated to innovate without undermining discipline, coherence, and control? Innovation in the military context does not imply unbounded creativity. Rather, it involves the capacity to adapt, recombine knowledge, and exercise judgment in the face of uncertainty while remaining aligned with political intent and institutional constraints. Educating officers thus requires a pedagogical model that goes beyond technical instruction and embraces epistemic humility, critical reflection, and experimental learning. Once again, Clausewitz offers a foundational insight for officer education. He rejects prescriptive systems and argues that theory should educate the mind of the commander rather than provide rules for action. War, shaped by friction, chance, and human emotion, resists mechanistic solutions. Military innovation divorced from political, ethical, and social context risks technical brilliance coupled with strategic failure. PME must therefore evolve with rank and responsibility, shifting from instruction to education, from doctrine to interpretation. As Clausewitz notes, genius in war is rare, but judgment can be educated. Educating officers for innovation is not a matter of adding creativity workshops or technology modules. It requires a philosophical reorientation of military education, from rule transmission to judgment formation, from certainty to critical engagement, from passive learning to reflective practice. Traditional military education systems, however, remain largely optimized for stability. They emphasize doctrinal mastery, procedural compliance, and the incremental improvement of established capabilities. Max Boot argues that history indicates the wisest course is to feel one's way, with careful study, radical experimentation, and freewheeling war games. Thus, paradoxically, revolutionary transformations often can be achieved in evolutionary increments. Historical wargame redesign as prototype warfare. Clausewitz argued that a closer look at the use of historical examples enables one to distinguish 4 points of view. First, historical examples may simply be used to exploit an idea. Abstract discussion, after all, is very easily misunderstood, or not understood at all. A historical example can shed necessary light on the idea and ensure that the reader and the writer remain in touch. At the heart of prototype warfare is a rejection of linear, plan-driven capability development and of rigid operational employment concepts. Layton argues that the fourth-generation industrial revolution enables a physical-digital physical (PDP) loop, in which ideas are rapidly translated into prototypes, tested in realistic conditions, digitally refined, and physically remanifested. For military education, the implication is clear: innovation cannot be taught as a deterministic process. Instead, it must be learned as a cycle of hypothesis formation, testing, feedback, and revision. Officers and specialists must be trained not merely to execute predefined orders but to identify problems, challenge assumptions, and adapt concepts in response to operational realities. This represents a shift from education focused on answers to education focused on questions. In prototype warfare, the central question is, what problem are we actually trying to solve, and under what conditions does this solution work, or fail? As per Layton's view, a learning organization can be created that considers continuous innovation a normal and desirable situation. The impetus for change now comes from within organizations rather than from impersonal external forces, as personnel are now central to experiments with the operational prototypes they have helped develop. Participants in the innovation ecosystem will be better able to propose innovations if they have a well-defined set of problems. What is the problem the military wishes them to solve? Within this, of course, is the fact that the military is not always sure what industry can offer, and so can unhelpfully modify the operational problem posed. Blank's innovation framework underscores that effective innovation depends on getting outside the building. In practice, this means engaging with operational units, local populations, and adversary tactics rather than planning in isolation. In military terms, this translates into education that is tightly coupled to field experimentation. Classrooms alone are insufficient, learning must occur in laboratories, exercises, test ranges, and operational deployments where assumptions collide with friction. In their restrictive effects, they can be grouped into a single concept of general friction. Is there any lubricant that will reduce this abrasion? Only one, and a commander and his army will not always have it readily available: combat experience. One of the most culturally challenging aspects of educating innovation for prototype warfare is the treatment of failure. Conventional military education tends to stigmatize failure, associating it with poor discipline or flawed leadership. Prototype warfare, by contrast, assumes that failure is both inevitable and necessary, provided it occurs early, cheaply, and informatively. Failure is a source of validated learning rather than organizational deficiency. The educational challenge is to normalize this logic within military institutions without undermining professional standards or operational safety. Prototype warfare emphasizes rapid experimentation, iterative design, and early testing of concepts before formal doctrine or force structures are finalized. While often associated with digital simulations or advanced technologies, prototype warfare can also be pursued through analog, low-cost, human-centered wargames that explore operational behavior, decision-making, and morale under conditions of uncertainty. This requires a deliberate pedagogical distinction between learning failure and operational failure. Innovation education must create protected spaces, experiments, simulations, wargames, controlled trials, where failure is not only permitted but expected. The purpose of such failure is not to assign blame but to refine understanding before systems are scaled or deployed at strategic consequence. Case study Taraketto. This case study demonstrates how a historical campaign can be repurposed as a prototype warfare tool for PME. Clausewitz's second point of view was that a historical example may serve to show the application of an idea, such as Taraketto for the Italian front in the First World War. An example allows one to demonstrate the operation of all those minor circumstances that could not be included in a general historical case study. Indeed, this is the difference between theory and experience. Taraketto is examined as an educational prototype wargame derived from the traditional Tarot card system. The game is remodeled to represent the Italian front of the First World War, particularly the Isonzo campaign. The case study demonstrates how a historical military campaign can be transformed into a prototype warfare model by repurposing a culturally embedded card game to explore morale, initiative, exhaustion, and limited cooperation within the coalition at the operational level. Tarot games are part of a long-standing European tradition of trick-taking card games, widely played across Central and Southern Europe and common to all former Austro-Hungarian imperial regions, e.g., Ukraine, Bohemia, Galicia, sometimes with regional specifics, and considered an Austrian game. Their persistent popularity in Austria, Slovenia, Italy, Hungary, and neighboring regions reflects a shared cultural literacy in probabilistic thinking, deception, and partnership dynamics. These characteristics make Tarot an unusually fertile foundation for wargaming. Taraketto deliberately exploits this cultural familiarity by embedding warfare concepts into a recognizable game structure. Rather than abstracting players into anonymous forces, the prototype situates them within the historical narrative of the 1915 to 1918 Italian front, where morale collapse, fatigue, and initiative mattered as much as firepower. This approach aligns with principles of prototype warfare by reducing barriers to experimentation while maintaining cognitive realism. In Taraketto, each player commands a faction and uses battles to model operational pressure, including morale erosion and recovery, initiative loss and regain, exhaustion over successive engagements, and constrained cooperation among nominal allies. If now considered the subjective nature of war briefly, the war has to be fought, which means that it will look more than ever like a gamble. Absolute, so-called mathematical, factors never find a firm basis in military calculations. From the very start there is an interplay of possibilities, probabilities, and good luck. In the whole range of human activities, war most closely resembles a game of cards. Each round represents a single battle, forming a 12-battle campaign that symbolically corresponds to the First World War's Isonzo campaign. This episodic structure enables cumulative effects to emerge organically through play, a hallmark of effective prototype warfare. The redesign process followed a core prototype warfare logic, retained the essential mechanics of the original system while reinterpreting their meaning. A defining feature of the prototype is its reinterpretation of cards as operational-level actors and conditions. Cards function simultaneously as mechanical tools and narrative devices. Kings represent political and command authority, with special rules reflecting constrained alliances and peacemaking efforts. Trumps symbolize initiative, operational freedom, and shock action. The Talon functions as an uncertainty engine, introducing historical events, reinforcement opportunities, or operational friction, and declarations reflect high-risk operational gambits, such as raids, morale offensives, or decisive maneuvers. The conduct of war thus became a true game, in which the cards were dealt by time and by accident. In effect, it was a somewhat stronger form of diplomacy, a more forceful method of negotiation, in which battles and sieges were the principal notes exchanged. Even the most ambitious ruler had no greater aims than to gain a number of advantages that could be exploited at the peace conference. By encoding these concepts directly into the card logic, Taraketto avoids excessive rule overlays and allows players to experience operational dilemmas intuitively rather than procedurally. Unlike many traditional war games that emphasize territorial control or attrition, Taraketto places morale at the center of operational success. Victory points are explicitly redefined as morale points, accumulated and lost across battles. The 12-battle campaign structure enables players to experience longitudinal operational effects, rather than isolated engagements. After 6 and 12 battles, assessment phases mirroring real-world operational pauses encourage reflection on strategic postures. From a prototype warfare perspective, this structure supports iterative learning. Players rapidly internalize which operational approaches generate sustainable morale advantages and which produce short-term gains at long-term cost. Taraketto demonstrates Clausewitz's statement about contrasting extreme views of the connection between successes in war, which holds that war consists of separate successes, each unrelated to the next, as in a match consisting of several games. The earlier gains have no effect on the later ones. All that counts is the total score, and each separate result contributes to it. This case study underscores that innovation in warfare concepts does not require abandoning tradition. On the contrary, carefully reinterpreted historical games can become powerful tools for understanding the enduring dynamics of war. Wargaming as preparation for algorithmic warfare. Algorithmic warfare, the employment of AI, machine learning, big data analytics, and human-machine teaming in military operations, poses profound challenges for contemporary armed forces. The challenges are not limited to technology acquisition or software integration. They extend to cognition, organizational learning, command authority, and decision-making under uncertainty. Clausewitz's third point of view was to use historical cases as support for statements, whereas one merely wants to prove the possibility of a phenomenon or effect. Traditional planning tools and deterministic models struggle to capture the emergent, probabilistic, and adaptive nature of intelligent machines. In this context, wargaming re-emerges not merely as a pedagogical or analytical instrument, but as a preparatory practice taken for algorithmic warfare. Wargaming offers a structured yet flexible environment in which human decision-makers can interact with intelligent systems, confront algorithmic opacity, and rehearse the organizational implications of human-machine teaming before such systems are committed to combat. Applegate, Burks, and Cameron define analytic wargaming as a dynamic representation of conflict or competition in a synthetic environment in which people make decisions and respond to the consequences of those decisions. This emphasis on human decision-making, rather than purely quantitative outcomes, makes wargaming particularly appropriate for exploring algorithmic warfare. Layton characterizes algorithmic warfare as the integration of intelligent machines into warfighting functions, enabling machines to assist, or increasingly influence, human military judgment. Unlike traditional automated systems, these intelligent machines are probabilistic, learning-driven, and capable of emergent behavior. Their outputs are not deterministic answers but confidence-weighted recommendations shaped by training data, algorithms, and environmental interaction. Paul Scar's framework of autonomy levels human in, on, and out of the loop illustrates how technological attempts to reduce uncertainty interact with Clausewitzian friction rather than eliminating it. Wargaming allows designers to keep humans in the loop, or on the loop, and to observe not only what decisions are made, but why they are made. Moreover, analytic wargaming is explicitly designed to investigate complex, adaptive, and cognitive systems, a description that applies equally to modern battlefields and to intelligent machines themselves. Algorithmic warfare systems learn, evolve, and sometimes surprise their users. On contemporary battlefields in Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran, algorithms for targeting support do not deliver planned effects. Wargaming is one of the few established defense practices comfortable operating in such non-deterministic spaces. This was observed during the MWCOE Russia-Georgia wargame-based experiment, where GAI learned, evolved, and surprised players with suggested solutions for mountain warfare and joint forces multi-domain campaigns. Intelligent machines are only as reliable as the data on which they are trained. Bias, incomplete datasets, and adversarial manipulation can all distort algorithmic outputs. These vulnerabilities are difficult to expose through technical testing alone, as they often emerge only in contested, adaptive environments. Wargaming excels precisely in this domain. By introducing imperfect information, deception, and unexpected adversary behavior, wargames can stress algorithmic systems in ways that mirror real conflict. Players can be forced to confront situations in which algorithmic recommendations conflict with human judgment, intelligence reporting, or ethical constraints. Algorithmic warfare cannot be mastered through technology acquisition alone. It requires institutional learning, cultural adaptation, and repeated exposure to new forms of uncertainty. Wargaming provides a mechanism for this learning. Such games do not seek to validate algorithms in a scientific sense, rather, they help organizations understand failure modes, trust boundaries, and decision thresholds. This aligns with Applegate, Burks, and Cameron's insistence that the true value of analytic wargaming lies not in predicting outcomes but in revealing why certain outcomes occur. By foregrounding human decision-making, embracing uncertainty, and enabling iterative learning, wargaming serves not only as an analytical method but as a form of cognitive rehearsal for algorithmic warfare. In doing so, it bridges the gap between technological possibility and operational wisdom, ensuring that intelligent machines enhance, rather than undermine, the art of command. Case study: the Mountain Warfare Multi-Domain Operations Wargame 2025. The Russia-Georgia historical wargame of the 2008 war was redesigned to provide an instructive case of algorithmic warfare in practice. The wargame revealed how increasing reliance on automated, networked, and algorithmically enabled systems altered the character of command, control, and combat decision-making. This case study examines how algorithmic warfare concepts can be explored by redesigning a historical wargame, using the Mountain Warfare Multi-Domain Operations (MDO) wargame conducted by the Mountain Warfare Center of Excellence (MWCOE) in September 2025 as its empirical foundation. The study focuses on integrating generative artificial intelligence (GAI) into a manually adjudicated wargame to assess its impact on decision-making, force employment, and multi-domain integration in complex terrain. Methodologically, the experiment followed the tradition of analytic wargaming, in which human decision-making remains central, but is deliberately stressed by new technologies and altered conditions. The historical 2008 Georgia-Russia conflict was selected as a baseline scenario and progressively redesigned to model algorithmic warfare by introducing AI-enabled decision support, terrain specialization, and multi-domain complexity. This approach reflects a growing recognition that algorithmic warfare is best understood not as a purely technical phenomenon, but as a socio-technical system involving humans, machines, data, and doctrine. The 2008 Georgia-Russia war was selected for its relevance to contemporary high-intensity operations, rapid escalation dynamics, and the interaction between conventional maneuver and information effects. This initial comparison demonstrated that AI assistance accelerated and improved the clarity and structure of decisions, particularly under time pressure, without fundamentally altering command authority. These findings reflect a core characteristic of algorithmic warfare: machines influence outcomes indirectly by shaping human judgment rather than executing actions themselves. On the second day, the historical scenario was redesigned to reflect mountain warfare conditions, replacing general-purpose infantry formations with specialized mountain infantry units. This redesign introduced terrain-driven constraints on mobility, logistics, observation, and fires, fundamentally altering the operational problem while preserving the original political and strategic context. The intent was to assess whether domain and environment-specific AI models provide greater value than general-purpose systems. The scenario was played twice, once without and once with AI support, allowing comparison across both force structure and decision support variables. Results indicated that AI tools tailored to the mountain warfare context produced more relevant and tactically grounded recommendations than generic models. This finding reinforces a central insight of algorithmic warfare: contextual specialization of algorithms matters as much as raw computational capability. On the third day, the scenario was further redesigned into an MDO framework, incorporating land, air, maritime, cyber, and space considerations. While not all domains could be fully represented in a manual wargame format, the redesign aimed to explore coordination challenges, cognitive load, and information integration across domains. In this phase, AI-assisted decision-making helped participants synthesize large volumes of heterogeneous information and explore alternative courses of action. The wargame revealed that multi-domain complexity amplifies the value of algorithmic assistance, particularly in staff functions related to integration and synchronization. At the same time, the experiment highlighted persistent limitations. AI systems struggled where information was ambiguous, contested, or deliberately deceptive, conditions that remain central to warfare. This reinforces the argument that algorithmic warfare enhances, but does not replace, human judgment. By combining historical grounding, controlled redesign, and AI-enabled experimentation, the wargame provided actionable insights for NATO concept development. Clausewitz's fourth point of view, as observed at the Russia-Georgia 2008 war experiment, was that the detailed presentation of a historical event and the combination of several events make it possible to deduce a doctrine. Conclusion and recommendations for professional military education. While the character of warfare is increasingly shaped by digitalization, AI, and complex human-machine interactions, PME remains overly anchored in classical, content-heavy pedagogical models. Interpreting Clausewitz's concept of friction for the digital battle space demonstrates that uncertainty, misalignment, and cognitive overload persist, albeit in new forms driven by algorithms, data dependency, and socio-technical complexity. Preparing officers to operate effectively under such conditions, therefore, requires a shift in how military education conceptualizes learning, cognition, and innovation. Evidence from NATO MWCOE-run wargaming design workshops and wargame-based warfighting experiments, learning innovation grounded in lean startup principles, shows that experimental, case-based, and cross-disciplinary learning environments significantly enhance officers' capacity for critical thinking, creativity, and collaborative problem-solving. These approaches do not replace classical military theory, rather, they operationalize it. Clausewitz remains relevant precisely because friction endures, but understanding and managing friction today requires officers who can experiment, adapt, and learn rapidly in the face of uncertainty. To address the identified gap between educational practice and operational reality, the following recommendations are proposed. PME curricula should systematically incorporate wargaming design workshops and/or innovation challenges, such as hacking for defense-type formats. These methods allow officers to confront real-world problems under time, data, and resource constraints, mirroring the conditions of contemporary operations. While doctrinal and historical knowledge remains essential, PME should prioritize how officers think over what they memorize. Assessment frameworks should explicitly evaluate critical thinking, adaptability, creativity, and team-based problem-solving as at Taraketto rather than relying primarily on factual recall. Understanding algorithmic bias, automation friction, and human-machine miscommunication should become a baseline competency. PME institutions should ensure officers are educated not as technologists, but as informed decision-makers capable of questioning, interpreting, and supervising AI-enabled systems, as the Russia-Georgia wargame AI-supported experiment at MWCOE, and faculty development programs should equip military educators to design and facilitate experimental learning environments. The instructor's role should evolve from transmitting knowledge to guiding inquiry, experimentation, and reflection. In sum, PME must evolve from a system optimized for certainty and standardization to one designed for friction, competition, and rapid change. By consciously aligning Clausewitz's theory with modern educational practice, military institutions can better prepare officers not only to understand war but to think creatively and act decisively within its enduring uncertainty. The author, Captain Peter Papola, Ph.D., Slovenian Naval Detachment, Head of the Concept and Development Branch at NATO Mountain Warfare Center of Excellence, MWCOE, is an associate professor at the Faculty of Government and European Studies at New University, Ljubljana. His research includes strategy, war, strategic leadership, warfighting, and operational art. The views contained in this article are the author's own and do not represent the views of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO MWCOE, the Slovenian Armed Forces or the Slovenian Ministry of Defense.
This was the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org. Thank you for listening.